Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Cafe Sci. My name is Dan Lavoie, and I'll be your host this evening. Cafe Sci is presented by PPG. Cafe Sci is also supported by the good people like you. Thank you to everyone who donated to support this program. If you are unable to donate but would still like to support Cafe Sci, the most helpful thing you can do is tell a friend. Cafe Sci takes place the first Monday of each month, and you can register for next month's speaker at CaminScienceCenter.org. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can enter the question at any time during the presentation. Also, for those in the audience, you can raise your hand and we'll get to your questions as quickly as we can. Tonight, I would like to present Carla Littleton. They are the Animal and Habitats Manager at the Kamin Science Center, where they oversee care for a diverse collection of species and develop engaging science education programs. A Pennsylvania certified science educator and master herpetologist, Carla specializes in ambassador animal husbandry and conservative education. Their work bridges biology, ecology, informal learning, inspiration, curiosity about the complex relationship between humans and other species. Thank you and welcome, Carla.
So hello, as Dan said, I work with our live animal collection here at Kamin Science Center. And we're going to talk about a couple different things today. We're going to look at a lot of definitions because a lot of the different definitions we have about our interactions with animals are really messy. We're going to talk a little bit about historical evidence. So we're going to look at some archaeological sites. And then we're going to turn toward our modern understanding and some of our social biases we may have about different animals that we interact with. So first thing I wanted to look at is definition. The definition of domestication is all over the place. For example, the use domestication definition says domesticated species can no longer survive in the wild. That means that cats, dogs, and horses are not domesticated because they could survive in the wild. The breeding definition, after 10 generations of selective breeding, by that definition, orcas and any animal we're doing a reintroduction program with is technically a domesticated animal. I don't think any of us here would think of an orca and go, yeah, that's my domesticated pet. The dictionary definition, really, a lot of people don't like it because it focuses on the benefit to humans. And we'll find out that that benefit goes both ways. So what I tend to look at is biology. So it's where one species is managing the survival and reproduction of another species. And there's mutual benefits and evolution of both species side by side. And the differential definition, which is the species is bred over multiple generations. And we see changes that result in the organism being genetically, phenotypically, meaning its appearance, and its behavior changes from its wild origins. That means that an animal may not behave like its wild cousins. We can see this with dogs. Most of us would not think our Chihuahua acts much like a wild wolf. So I like to stick with those two definitions. There are other definitions. There are public definitions where we might only include mammals. A lot of the public would say domesticated animals and pets, mammals. If we talk about a companion animal being a snake, a lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with that. And it's a pathway. So we need to think about starting with a wild animal. We have whatever wild animal we're working with. And the first part of that process is taming it. Now, taming happens on an individual. That means you think about yourself as an early human. There's a wolf out there. You think it's really cool looking. You want to get closer to it. You're feeding it. A lot of us do that with our wild birds, our squirrels. They get used to humans. They're tame. They're not domesticated. We haven't done anything to them. They're just okay with human interactions. Once we get into selective breeding, that's when we start that spectrum from being a tame wild animal into a population that is domesticated. And breeding typically is not always choice. Like Humans aren't actually doing it. So if you think about, go back to our early human ancestor, and we see our neighbor has goats, and they can make wool, and they've got milk and meat all year round, and we want to do that. So what are we going to do? We're going to go out and collect a bunch of goats, and we're going to have them in a pen. And if we have a male goat that's butting into us all the time, we're probably going to eat that goat. We don't want him doing that. He's going to injure someone. If we have a female that maybe doesn't reproduce offspring, it means we don't get more goats. We may not want to keep her in that population. We're not purposefully selectively breeding those animals, but we're limiting their gene pool. So that's where we start with selective breeding. It's not purposeful. Now, once you get those animals where, we're starting, we got a bunch of goats, and one culture really loves milk and they make cheese, so they're breeding for goats that produce lots of milk. Someone in the north might be producing for wool, so they're going to take the ones with the longest wool and breed those ones. That's when you start getting into more purposeful selective breeding. And then the last step, we don't really want animals to go this step. That's feral or invasive. This is when a captive animal that we would consider domesticated gets out in the wild and is no longer tame. Feral cats, for example, feral horses. It's interesting when you think about what we call feral and what we call invasive. We'd be very uncomfortable saying that we have an invasive cat colony. We have a feral cat colony. But we have no problem saying that we have invasive spiders or an invasive pigeon. Pigeons were bred for captivity for long periods of time. We technically call them an invasive species. We don't always call them feral. So a lot of that, whether it's feral or invasive, is going to be based on social views of those animals and not necessarily what's actually happening with them. When we look at time frames, of course, wolves very early, 14,200 years ago, but genetics suggests that could be up to 100,000 years ago. Those wolves at that 14,000 year point are not really wolves. We would probably say genetically those are domesticated dogs. A lot of them very similar to sight hounds. And we want to include other things on here. Silkworms. We don't often think about insects being domesticated. Got 7,000 years ago. We've got people domesticating caterpillars. I did focus on plants, but a lot of this information would be true for plants as well. A lot of these are extinct. So like the original horse, the original wild horse that we got our modern horses from, we don't have that species anymore. And in fact, they found genetically the wolves that dogs are related to are not very close to our modern wolves. Dogs and modern wolves are less closely related genetically than ancient wolves and dogs. So let's get a little into the archaeological record. This is Chauvet Cave, France. This is one of the most beautiful caves. If you've seen cave paintings of lions and charging bison, this is probably the cave you're thinking about. This is 26,000 years ago. So this is a long time ago. And what you're seeing here, if you look at your right-hand picture, you see two footprints. Those are wolf footprints. And walking with this wolf is a 7 or 8 year old child in the cave by themselves. And we know that they're walking together because there's sometimes when the wolf's footprints are under the human's footprints. Sometimes they're over the child's footprint. We also know that this child was carrying a torch and bent down to clean its torch, and the wolf sat and waited for it. So we have people 26,000 years ago trusting a wolf in a cave with their child. So would you call this a domestic dog? Is this a domesticated animal? Is this a wild animal? We don't know because we don't have anything other than these footprints. The footprints are very large. That's why they say it's a wolf. But we don't really know. This animal could have been like bred by these people who were doing cave painting, and that could be the beginning of a domestic animal. This is also a really interesting burial. This is Bonn Oberkassel in Germany. This is about 14,500 years ago. That's where that number comes from On that chart we saw a few minutes ago, this is a domesticated dog, looks very much like a sighthound, was buried with 2 humans. This dog had distemper. It survived with distemper for several months, which means the people were helping it through epileptic seizures. They were feeding it. They were cleaning it. They were providing it with water, keeping it warm. This animal had a lot of injuries from falling over. That's how they know it had epilepsy. It has all the markings on its teeth showing that it was eating rocks, which is a common problem with animals that are far along in a distemper infection. It starts to affect their neurology and they start eating things that aren't food. So we know that this animal was cared for, and it's a puppy. It's only about 7 months old. So we know that this animal was cared for by humans. Probably not a wild animal, probably definitely domesticated, definitely very loved by the people that were taking all of this time and energy. This also is one of the fossils they use to break down that myth that wolves started working for humans and with humans as hunters. This animal could not hunt. This animal could barely walk. So we know that maybe that was the start, but by the time we're seeing something looks really domesticated, and we would see maybe as a modern dog, we've moved past that. And this is the Einon dog. This Fertile Crescent, this woman here is a middle-aged woman. She's buried with another puppy. This puppy has the genetics of what we would consider a domestic dog, a modern dog. We're pretty sure that the dog was killed to be buried with her. That would have been very common at this time in human history because there was a belief that that animal would go to the afterlife with those people. And we can see on left-hand side, well, your right-hand side, dogs hunting ibex. This is the same breed of dog, the Kamin dog, that is buried with this woman. So we know already between 8,000 and 15,000 years ago in the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, we have what we would consider a modern domestic dog. So what does it mean? What does it mean when I say that these animals look more domesticated? And what we're looking at for traits that we want to see in an animal we want to keep with us, that we want to work with. We want something that has good temperament, meaning we want it to interact with us politely. We don't want it to be nipping at us, kicking us, those sorts of things. We're often looking at cute factors. We're breeding the animal that looks the cutest sometimes, especially with companion animals, those dogs, cats, other animals that are living in close proximity with us. One of the crazy things that I learned while I was researching this is about 5,000 years ago, people were domesticating rats as pets. They had no food use. They were not eating them. They were not using them for anything, but they had them in their homes. Same thing is true for mice. And that's something when we're thinking about, the history of human and animal interaction, we're thinking about dogs, cats, and horses, but it applies to a lot of different animals. We want work and benefits. We want an animal that's going to work with us, whether that's you're a farmer or a hunter, or if you're a cat eating mice in your house that you don't want there, keeping out intruders, those sorts of things. We want them not to fear us. So this is where taming comes in. That's where taking the animals that have the least fear, are the least fearful, and have the most desire to interact with us. Those are the ones we're breeding to get that. We want them to seek our companionship. So this is common. Talk to a person who farms cattle or sheep, and they talk about going up to the fence and their cattle run up to them. That's one of the things we breed for, because we want to be able to interact with that animal. It's no good if you have to chase your milk cow for an hour before you can milk it. We want them to have good, strong breeding and offspring. That's going to perpetuate those animals that can be our companions. And then recognizing social cues. This is very important when we think about things like service animals. We want them to be able to recognize what we need. Some dogs, like PTSD dogs that are trained to serve, especially with veterans, recognize when that person is having anxiety or problems and can lead them away. They have to understand social cues. This is also true for herding dogs. If I am herding sheep, a lot of sheep herders' dogs are using hand signals. But I'm sure any of you who have pets have seen this. How many of you have come home, you're feeling like crap, you're crying, whatever's happened, and your dog or cat comes up to you? But it doesn't have to be dogs or cats. A lot of people talk about other animals doing that. Birds, mice. I've heard about it with snakes, turtles, rabbits. So those are other social cues that are being read. They can see that we're upset, they're seeking our companionship, and they're looking to make things better. So how does this all happen? And what happens is genetics. So as we breed our animals, we get some weird things that happen. We breed for temperament and work and body shape and all of those other things. And these characteristics come out: floppy ears, color patterns that aren't normal, shorter muzzles, longer hair, smaller bodies. And it happens with most animals. Happens with dogs, happens with horses. We see it in geckos, and we see it in snakes. Think about all the color morphs of snakes you see. A lot of times, those morphs first show up when you're breeding for a tame animal, an animal that is okay with human interaction. So this is what's called, sometimes they'll call it domestication syndrome. It's the idea that when we breed for something that we want our domestic animals to do, we get these other traits that come out. And for a long time, we didn't know why. And we still don't exactly know what the connection is with some of these traits. But Dmitry Belyov, back in 1959, started thinking, well, what is happening? How do we know that this is what's happening? So he started with wild foxes in Russia. He started with the species that's there, black, with the silver on its coat. And he started breeding these animals. And by the time he got to about 10 generations, he started seeing floppy ears, saw white face stripes, white socks. Boris, that's the white one down there, is currently in San Diego, working at a canine facility. If I just showed you that, you might think that's a German Shepherd. It looks a lot like a white German Shepherd. It's not, it's a fox. So what he was doing is he was breeding solely for those characteristics that make the animal tame. He kept his researchers from becoming too friendly with the foxes so that they wouldn't pick which ones were getting bred because they were cute. Because we all know if it looks more like a dog, we're going to think it's cuter, we're going to want to breed it. But he tried to keep that out of it so that he could see whether or not those traits were just linked to those tame traits. And he found that it looks like it might be. It looks like it might be actually linked. That puppy there with the floppy ears was the first one in the 10th generation that had its floppy ears. They're still running this experiment. We're about 50 generations in, and they find out about 70%, 70 to 80% of the foxes now seek out human companionship. There are some behavioral problems. There are some very fox-like behaviors they still have. And one of the things the researchers are thinking about is we never tried to train these animals. If you were working with a dog, for example, we were probably training them as we were bringing them from the wild into being in human companionship. We didn't do that with these, so we might not have weeded out some of the traits that would have been weeded out with dogs. And that's why we have some of these wild behaviors still in there. The one researcher who works with Boris talks about how he snuck in and while she wasn't looking, peed in her coffee because she wasn't paying attention to him. And that's a behavior, if we had a dog that was doing that, we'd be like, maybe we don't want to breed that one. Maybe we want to look at some behavioral modifications. Now we're really going to turn into some weird stuff, though. What happens when humans aren't the thing domesticating something else? A lot of those definitions said humans were doing it. That black fish up there, the long-fin damselfish, is both a farmer and a rancher. So what they do is they eat algae. And they have algae farms. They pick their algae up and they put it in the algae farm. They defend their algae farm. They have these little shrimp that keep it clean. And they pick the shrimp that take good care of their algae. And they found some weird things while they're studying these fish, is that the shrimp are attracted to the smell of this specific species of damselfish, which is weird because a lot of damselfish eat shrimp. So this is kind of a strange thing. And they also found out for the fish that fish who have good populations of shrimp taking care of their algae have better nutrition and better health. So something is going on there. We haven't researched it enough, but we know that these fish are domesticating algae to grow and recruiting shrimp to work their algae farms to keep them clean, to make the food more nutritious. And it's very strange. We also see this in ants with mealybugs and with some other insects, scale insects, for example, where the ants will herd and keep scale insects or mealybugs that produce lots of sweet honeydew and sort of pitch out the ones that aren't good at it. We have leafcutter ants that farm fungus, and there's a specific, the fungus that's in their nest is different than the species when it's outside their nest. So we know that there's some sort of weird domestication going on in other species where humans aren't even involved. So we're going to turn a little bit toward modern ideas. What about exotics? We hear the term exotic all the time, exotic animals. It's another one of those problematic terms. It has a lot of different definitions. Exotic a lot of times just means it's not native to the area it's in. So if we thought about that definition, every cat is exotic. The original cat species is not native to North America. It can mean things that aren't normally kept. So you'll see there's some cattle species that are common in Africa that if we have them here, they're considered exotic cattle. But are they an exotic animal? Is that what we're thinking about? Probably not. We think about it as non-domesticated. That's a common thing that's used when you're talking about anything that's not a mammal or bird. Exotic is kind of used to separate them so that we can say these are our pets and these are our exotic pets. But the term pet doesn't work with the term exotic, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. But a lot of this is societal bias. And the reason there's a picture of a tarantula up there is I'm going to talk about tarantulas for just a moment. Tarantulas have been bred in the United States and in some other countries since about the 1930s. Some of the common species. And what we're seeing in tarantulas is that they can survive in captivity. And the ones that are bred in captivity, if you give them the habitat, humidity and temperature and stuff that they would have in their wild environment, don't survive as well anymore. Which tells us we're moving down that road to something that is working with human care. And there's not really a lot of research because it's not a mammal. There's a big call in a lot of the more exotic, what we call exotic pet keepers, to look at things like lizards and fish and these other things that we as keepers would say, this acts just like our dog. I tell people all the time I have a large python. I say it's like everything in the behavior of a cat plus the personality and intelligence of a toddler. But it does have cat-like behavior. It wants your attention when it wants your attention. It's sort of antisocial, will rub its head on you. A lot of these things that we would think, that's kind of what we want. That's kind of what we want to see from our animals that we're working with. And a lot of these animals too have been bred for a long time. We think it's something new. Things like betta fish. The 13th century, we started breeding betta fish. A lot of people look at betta fish, that's an exotic fish, or it's just a fish. It's not even a pet. Koi are similar. We've been breeding koi for a long time. The wild variety that's in Asia maybe 14th century. We're already breeding them. Crested geckos and things since the 80s and 90s. A lot of the things we'd consider exotic pets, so the reptiles, amphibians, and fish, we've been breeding since somewhere between the 40s and 70s. That includes things like ball pythons, Burmese pythons, bearded dragons, crested geckos, leopard geckos. Guppies have been bred since the 1800s. So when we think about exotic animals and we're trying to separate them from pets, it might not be as clear cut as we want it to be. So what is a pet? The legal definition of a pet is a domesticated animal, which is an important thing to realize that that's in there, such as a rodent, fish, turtle, or other animal. So reptiles and fish legally are pets. And this is from the Cornell Law School. So this is something that is taught to law students. There are other definitions too that include that it must be kept in a household, cared for affectionately, but it still has that list of animals. And they're kept for pleasure or companionship rather than use. So this is where you get into the difference between a working dog and a pet dog. Working dog has a job. It may still be a pet. It may come home and be a pet when it's at home, but it has work. But companion animals are just for companionship, and pets are companion animals. What are the costs and benefits? So the state is irreversible. That snake is a color morph that would not probably survive in the wild. And it's not reversible. We've changed the genetics so much for a lot of animals that even if we tried to re-release them in the wild, they probably wouldn't thrive. They may not survive well. We might have the risk of interbreeding and health decline. So we see that sometimes with pug-nosed dogs. There's health problems that come with it. If we're not careful with how we breed our animals, we can cause interbreeding, which can be bad for that species. We need to manage the genetics. There are a lot of registries, whether it's a zoo or it's a breeder of something like lizards. There are a lot of movements toward making sure we watch the genetics and we keep those animals healthy. AKC has one. There's one for thoroughbreds. We're looking at managing that genetics for the health of the animals. And a place for animals and no place. Some animals that are in captivity that we might well, we as in I and maybe not someone else, we consider domesticated, have no place in the wild. There's a species of cockroach that people keep as pets. It was in one cave, and that's the only place it lived. And someone went and collected some, and thankfully they did because it had bauxite in it, and they decided that the bauxite was worth more than the animals that were in the cave. And now there's no cave for that animal. So sometimes animals that are extinct in the wild, if they are kept in captivity, sometimes it's the pet keepers, as much as zoos or other organizations that might be keeping that species genetics alive. And the biggest benefit for the animal is lifespan. No stress, no predators, access to food and water. And that's if you have good husbandry. And that's why, we want education. A lot of animals make great pets, but you need to know how to take care of them. We have to be responsible with it. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. If we think about that definition of pets and perhaps thinking about domesticated animals, an animal that eats a lot or is very large may not make the greatest domestic animal. Elephants love working with people. Would they make a great household pet? No, absolutely not, because we could domesticate them, but maybe we shouldn't because of the care involved. And what makes a good candidate? So some animals are just not good candidates for being domestic animals. Animals that like to be in isolation, tigers, for example, need big open spaces, don't really like contact with other tigers, don't really want to contact with a lot of other things. They may not be the greatest candidate for a household pet. Whereas an animal that's very social, likes companionship with others of its own species, you can get into a situation where a human could become part of that animal's family group, and then it makes it a good potential animal to live with us. We need to make sure as breeders that we're taking our role seriously, that we're responsible for not only the animals we're breeding, but what animals we're bringing in to become potential pets for other people. We as breeders and keepers have a lot of knowledge that someone who's just looking at that animal and saying, it looks really cool or cute, might not know what they're getting into. So we have to be ready to be that. And then the role of owners, making sure your animal is not released. And the other thing is making sure that there's a place for owners that for some reason cannot keep that animal. We tend to look down on people who are like, I had to take my animal to a rescue because I don't have the money, I had to move. And when we think about it, we don't want to tell those people not to do that. We want them to be responsible and think, hey, I'm not providing the best I can for this animal. It's time for it to move on to someone who can. And that's okay. That's really an okay thing to do. So these are two books. If you're interested in the history between humans and animals, these are two great books to read. Intimate Bond goes through several different species like camels and goats and horses and how they shaped human culture. And the other one, Creatures of Empire, deals with how animals in captivity changed early American culture as people came to the Americas, and not just people who are coming in, but also the people that were here who got horses for the first time and got to work with horses and things like that. So those are two really good books if you're interested in more of this. And then I guess questions. And I will take any questions. There's a long list of sources, which you can't really see very well, but.
Question? Feel free to raise your hand and we'll come around to you. If not, we'll go ahead and conclude for the evening. Any questions? All right, excellent.
When pigs escape captivity and become boars again, are they still a different species than wild boars? And if they reproduce, do they kind of revert back towards boar-like, or what happens there?
So there's two reasons why we call them boars. One is because of the breeding stock that those pigs that are now feral came from. They came from wild boar stock. Not every pig breed comes from the same stock. But yeah, they do revert to a more wild temperament and behavior. And that's true for a lot of animals that become feral, is that because they have to survive in that wild environment, again, they'll pick up a lot of those traits that kept them safe when they were still wild, before they came into human contact. They also get bigger. Wild the feral hogs tend to get a little bigger. And they believe that is because smaller ones are weeded out by predators. When they're in captivity, especially pig species that might be kept as companions, we breed for tiny and cute. And the wild doesn't necessarily breed for tiny and cute.
I didn't notice in your list of traits that we breed for to say intelligence. And I think about this because we've had a lot of dogs over the years and a lot of foster dogs for a short time. And you notice when you think of the purebreds that, yeah, they look really cute and they're dumb as a brick. I've had someone actually describe their, purebred as dumb as a brick. And I wondered how they might do that too, because you've got a lot of individual part of that, but do they just happen upon that, or?
It can depend what you're breeding for. So if we think about a purebred German Shepherd that might be being a working dog, we are breeding for intelligence because we want it to be able to work. But if you're breeding for a lap dog, sometimes kind of dumb is kind of cute. We might not want to say that out loud, but it is. Or we might just be breeding for aesthetics. Because it's not going to be a working animal, we're breeding more for aesthetics or ability and desire to play rather than intelligence.
All right. If we have no more questions, we don't have any from our online community. We will apologize to, one more question.
Jen?
I had a question.
Sure.
How do you think, or do you think that with the advancements of reintroducing quote unquote extinct animals' genomes back into the world, like with the dire wolves, that was a big thing a while ago. Do you think our understandings of domestic animals and like exotic animals might change through that?
So the interesting thing about that dire wolf thing is it appears to be a dire wolf. It's not genetically a dire wolf. So we don't have that ancient genetics where someone just tried to breed something that looked like a dire wolf. You could get into ancient genetics. I've heard some like research kicking around about attempting to complete the genome of things like mammoths and woolly rhinos. It'd be really difficult. It's the whole Jurassic Park thing. You don't got the whole genome, and we really don't know what we need to put in there. And if that movie's taught us anything, maybe we don't want to go there. And also, it'd have no place to live. Woolly mammoths needed huge tundra areas, and we know climate change, we're losing all our permafrost in that sort of environment. Even if we did get one, where would we put it? But there are some great techniques that are coming around for animals that are extinct in the wild, which is very rare. There's a lot of genetics that's going on. There's an organization called Species 360 that is cataloging literally the genetics of every animal that's in captivity. They're getting together zoos and aquariums and small collections like ours and all these collections to understand genetics. That way, if we have something like rhinos where there's only a few left, we can have geneticists involved. We can see how that animal is performing in captivity. We can watch for traits that might make it a good candidate or its offspring good candidates for reintroduction. One of the things that happens with reintroduction is a lot of the animals that we'd like to reintroduce either don't have space, the habitat needs to be completely rebuilt. There's misconceptions about them. So if we think about something like a Burmese python, here in the United States, they're an invasive species. We're afraid of them, we don't like them, they're in the Everglades. They're close to endangered in their native habitat. So, there's those sorts of things too, where the mindset of one group of people might not match with, the perception that we need to get those animals back into the wild where they belong. It happens a lot with predators, wolf reintroductions and coyote reintroductions and pine martens. Pine martens are really cute. They want to reintroduce them here in Pennsylvania. They were once native here. A lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with it. It just keeps getting shelved. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But ancient genetics are really hard because it breaks down over time. Okay.
When you showed the non-human interactions and the fish, so it made me think of the symbiotic, used to be the big word of these relationships where like two animals interact to benefit them both. Do you think of that as the same with domestication, that it's really more of a symbiotic relationship?
So I would say that most domestic animals, it is a symbiotic relationship. I would argue that dogs, cats, turtles, whatever, we gain something from their presence. They gain something for our presence. It is symbiotic. Why they came to that conclusion with the damselfish is because they seem to be selectively breeding the animals. They're getting rid of what they would perceive as poor genetics. And they're not looking at genetics, of course, because they don't know what genetics is necessarily, probably, but they're looking, maybe this shrimp doesn't stay on task. We're gonna eat it and get rid of it because it's not helping us. But also that fish does protect the shrimp and keeps all the other fish away from them so they don't get eaten. So there is a benefit for on both sides. But the reason they lean more toward it being like a sort of pseudo domestication is because there's selective breeding going on.